In this video, I want to look at James chapter 2, verses 14 to 26, where James talks about the subject of faith and works. And in particular, I want to look at the context of verse 24, when James says that a man is justified by works and not by faith alone. And a lot of people, they take this verse and they say, well, James contradicted Paul. James and Paul had a different opinion on how to be saved. Because Paul said very clearly in Romans chapter 3 that a man is justified by faith apart from the works of the law. It's very clear in that context as well that when he says the works of the law, he includes the moral law, because he says through the law is the knowledge of sin. And so people take this verse and they say, well, look, James and Paul clearly had a different perspective on salvation. And so what I want to do is I want to just take you through this passage in James, verse by verse, beginning at verse 14 through to the end of the chapter, verse 26. And I want to show you that James and Paul don't actually disagree about the topic of faith and works. Now, there's a couple of things that are worth noting right at the beginning. First of all, James and Paul are coming at this subject from a different perspective. Paul, when you read the book of Galatians, is coming at this subject from the perspective of legalism. That is, people who, think that you have to do these things and do certain actions in order to be saved. Whereas James is coming at this from the perspective of people who are clearly living in sin and yet claiming to have faith. He talks about people who just neglect the poor, treat the rich with favoritism. He talks about people in this epistle who are, blessing God with their mouth and then cursing each other with their mouths. And he talks about, taking advantage of the poor and so forth. And you see that there's these people here that James is writing to who are hearers of the law, but not doers of the law. And so James is coming at this from a different perspective to Paul. Now, it's important also to note, and I'm going to show you this as we go through the text, that James, when he talks about faith, when he talks about dead faith, when he talks about, somebody who says he has faith but doesn't have works, he's really describing a different kind of faith to the kind of faith that the Apostle Paul describes. The Apostle Paul is describing, especially when you read Galatians, I think it's chapter 5, verse 6, he talks about faith that works through love. So he's talking about a faith that actually produces works. That's what Paul is actually talking about. I don't know if that reference to Galatians 5 verse 6 is accurate, but that's the kind of faith that Paul is talking about, the kind of faith that actually produces works. Whereas James is really attacking the kind of faith that doesn't produce works, a dead faith, an inactive faith. And so there's a difference between the way that Paul uses the word faith and the way that James uses the word faith. Very important. Another thing that's different is the way that Paul uses the term justification and the way that James uses the word justification. When Paul uses the term justification, most of the time he's talking about a legal justification before God, that we are declared righteous legally before God. But James is using the word justification in a different sense. He's talking about justification in the sense of proving the genuineness, vindicating your claim to have faith. And I think there's a difference between these two uses of the word justification, and we'll see that as we're going through the text together. So let's get right into it. Let's begin at verse 14, and it says this: "What does it profit, my brethren, if somebody says he has faith but does not have works? Can faith save him?" Now, I quickly want to point out a couple of things here about this first verse. First of all, James is talking about somebody that says they have faith, but they don't have works. So somebody that says they have faith, but they don't have works. Then he says, can faith save him? And many scholars have pointed out that in the Greek, it can be translated, can that faith save him? And you see this in the ESV, the NIV, other translations. Can that faith save him? And that's because literally in the Greek it says, can the faith save him? Because it uses the definite article. And so it's talking about a particular kind of faith, the kind of faith in context that doesn't produce works. Can the faith that doesn't produce works, can that faith save someone? And the answer is no. Already we see we're talking about a different kind of faith to what the Apostle Paul is talking about, because the Apostle Paul clearly talks about a faith that actually produces works through love. Faith that worketh through love. So we're talking about two completely different kinds of faith. Let's keep reading here. If a brother or sister is naked and destitute of daily food, and one of you says to them, "Depart in peace, be warm and filled," but you do not give them the things which are needful for the body, what does it profit? Thus also faith by itself, if it does not have works, is dead. Now you have to ask yourself the question, if you're in church and you see somebody who's naked and destitute, they've got nothing, and you say to them, "Be warm and be filled," you have to ask yourself the question, do your words really carry any real truth to them? Do you really care about that person? Do you really mean what you're saying? And obviously the answer is no. And in the same way, if somebody says that they have faith, but they don't have works, then they don't truly believe, right? Their faith is a kind of a fake faith, a mere mental assent to the facts of the gospel, but there's no real heart in it. They don't truly believe the gospel. Let's keep reading here. But someone will say, "You have faith and I have works. Show me your faith without your works, and I will show you my faith by my works." Now this is really interesting because this here sets the tone for what James is trying to communicate. He's not talking about, being justified before God in heaven. He's talking to people who claim that they have faith, but they're clearly living lives of sin. And he's saying, look, show me your faith. He's talking about proving your faith to others. That's really what James is talking about here. And if somebody says that they have faith, but they don't have works, then they don't truly have faith. That's the point that James is trying to make here. And you see also there's a cross-reference in my study Bible to James 3:13, which carries a similar idea, talking about a different subject, talking about wisdom. It says this, "Who is wise and understanding among you? Let him show by good conduct that his works are done in the meekness of wisdom." So he's kind of saying here in this other passage in James chapter 3 verse 13, look, if you think you're wise, if you claim to be wise, prove it. Prove that you're wise by your wise words and your wise actions, right? Well, in the same way here, James is saying in chapter 2 verse 18, you say you have faith, show me your faith without your works. You can't. You can't show your faith without works. And James says, I will show you my faith by my works. A very clear passage here. Verse 19, it says, you believe that there is one God. You do well. Even the demons believe and tremble. Now, this is very important because the kind of faith that demons have is very different to the kind of faith that a believer has, right? Demons believe the facts of who God is and who Christ is and what Christ did on the cross. Demons believe that stuff. They know these things are true. But the kind of faith that they have is mere mental assent, mere acceptance of the truth of these things, but they don't truly have faith in the same sense that a believer has faith. A true believer who has been changed, born again, loves God, his faith is a trust in God, a wholehearted devotion to God. His faith is very different to the kind of faith that a demon has, right? So we're talking about two completely different kinds of faith. Verse 20, but do you want to know, O foolish man, that faith without works is dead? Was not Abraham our father justified by works when he offered Isaac his son on the altar? Now, this is the first time that James uses the word justified here in his discourse on faith and works. But James is not using the word justified in the same sense that the Apostle Paul uses the word justified when he talks about being justified from our sin through faith in Jesus Christ. When Paul talks about justification in that context, he's talking about a legal justification before God. But here in this passage, it's very different. James is talking about proving the genuineness of your faith. He's talking about being vindicated in the sense of proving that your faith is genuine. Let me give you some verses where the word justified is used in this kind of way. If you go to the Gospel of Luke, you see Jesus says this in Luke chapter 7, verse 35, but wisdom is justified by all her children. Now, you have to ask yourself the question, when Jesus uses this word justified, and it's the exact same word as what James and Paul uses, is he talking about, wisdom being declared righteous, before God by her children? No, I don't think so. He's saying that wisdom is proven to be true proven, vindicated. That kind of meaning. It's got that kind of meaning here. Wisdom is vindicated and proven to be true by her children. Let me give you another one. This is 1 Timothy. 1 Timothy chapter 3, verse 16. It says, "And without controversy, great is the mystery of godliness. God was manifest in the flesh, justified in the Spirit, seen by angels, preached among the Gentiles, believed on in the world, received up into glory." Now you have to ask yourself the question, how is the Apostle Paul using the word justified in this particular context? Is he saying that Jesus was, justified in the sense of being declared righteous in a legal sense? I don't think so. I personally think this is talking about the resurrection. And it's saying here, God was manifest in the flesh, that's Jesus, justified in the Spirit, proven to be true. And I think this is a reference to the resurrection, because it goes on to say, seen by angels, preached among the Gentiles, believed on in the world, and received up into glory. And so I think that this is saying that Jesus was proven to be true. His words and everything he said was proven to be true at his resurrection. And you can see that the word justified is used in a different sense in those passages, and I think it's used in a different sense here in James to the way that Paul would usually use the word justified when he talks about being justified from our sin through faith in Jesus Christ. I think the word justified can be interpreted differently depending on the context, even within the writings of the Apostle Paul. And so basically James is saying here that Abraham, our father, was justified by works in the sense that he proved the genuineness of his faith when he offered his son Isaac on the altar. I think that's very clear here. Verse 22, it says here, "Do you see then that faith was working together with his works, and by works faith was made perfect? And the scripture was fulfilled, which says, Abraham believed God, and it was accounted to him for righteousness, and he was called the friend of God. You see then that a man is justified by works and not by faith alone." Now here in this passage, James again uses the word justified, and he says that a man is justified by works and not by faith alone. And people take this and they say, look, James clearly taught a different gospel to the Apostle Paul, because the Apostle Paul says we're justified by faith apart from works, and James very clearly here says that we're justified by works and not by faith alone. So the Apostle Paul must be wrong. Some people say, well, maybe we're interpreting Paul wrong, and they say, well, Martin Luther and John Calvin and the Reformers, they were all wrong about salvation by faith alone. Is this true? No, because James again is using the word justified in a different sense to the way that the Apostle Paul uses it when he talks about being justified from our sin before God through faith in Jesus Christ. James is using the word justified in the sense of proving the genuineness, vindicating your claim to have faith. How do we know that? For a couple of reasons. First of all, in the context, he says, show me your faith without your works, and I will show you my faith by my works. Very clear. But also, verse 23, it very clearly here says that Abraham believed God and it was accounted to him for righteousness. Now, this is a quote from Genesis 15. And this is before Isaac was even born. So he was accounted as righteous. He was reckoned as righteous when he believed the promise that he would have a son. And then his faith was proven or vindicated, proven to be true when he offered Isaac as a sacrifice. So this is how James is using it. He's using it in a very different sense to the way that the Apostle Paul uses it when he talks about being justified from our sin before God through faith in Jesus Christ. Now, it's also worth noting that between this period when Abraham believed in Genesis 15, and it was credited to him as righteousness, he was reckoned as being righteous, between that and the offering up of Isaac, Abraham actually sinned a number of times. Yet his faith was still proven to be true when he offered up Isaac on the altar, right? Abraham, he committed adultery with his maidservant Hagar, with his wife's maidservant Hagar, And he lied about his wife. He deceived. He was not truthful, however you want to put it, about Sarah being his wife a number of times. And he allowed his wife to be taken off to another man's harem rather than being, risking his own life. Now, he could have avoided that issue a number of other ways. I mean, I could have thought of a few. I mean, he could have, dressed her in rags before he got there. He could have messed up her hair, put a bit of mud on her face and maybe a bit of, manure on her, and she would smell and no man would want her, right? But instead he chose to lie, and he allowed his wife to be taken by another man into that man's harem, which is pretty full on. I think we should be willing to lay down our lives for our wives so that that sort of thing wouldn't happen to them. So we can see that Abraham, he sinned, but yet he still had works. And we as Christians, it is possible for a Christian to still sin. Yet that doesn't mean his faith is not genuine, because our faith is shown when you look at the totality of our lives through our works. And so it's the same as Abraham. So this is not a contradiction of salvation by faith alone or faith apart from works. It's not a contradiction of that whatsoever. James is using the word justified in a different sense to the way that the Apostle Paul is using it. Now let's keep reading here. Likewise, was not Rahab the harlot also justified by works when she received the messengers and sent them out another way? For as the body without the spirit is dead, so faith without works is also dead. You see, James is not telling us that we need to add works to our dead faith. That's not what James is telling us. James is telling us that we need to have a real and living faith. And that faith will produce works, the same as what the Apostle Paul is saying. And, Rahab, if she didn't truly believe that God was going to give Israel victory, she never would have, helped the spies. But because she truly believed that the God of Israel was the one true God, and the God of Israel was going to side with Israel and give Jericho into their hands, she acted on what she truly believed and helped these spies to get away. And it's interesting because Rahab was the great-grandmother of King David, or great-great-great-grandmother of King David. So, he was, it was the messianic lineage. She was one of Christ's ancestors, one of the ancestors of Jesus Christ himself. And so when I look at this, I just don't see any contradiction between James and Paul. And I don't see any contradiction between James and the reformers. John Calvin, he said, we're saved by faith alone, but true faith is never alone. Martin Luther, in his commentary, especially his commentary on Galatians chapter 5, verse 6, is very clear, and also Romans chapter 3, in his commentary on Romans chapter 3, is very clear that true faith will always produce works. And he says that if somebody says they have faith but they don't produce works, Martin Luther says that they're hypocrites and they'll be shut out from the kingdom of Christ. And so I don't see any contradiction between James and the Apostle Paul, or James and the Reformers and Martin Luther and the Protestants and so forth. So I hope you like this video. If you have, please consider subscribing. Give me a thumbs up. Hit the bell notification button. I'll see you in the comments section, and you'll see me in my next video.